Hi there, I'm Zach Keetle, a senior at Sacred Heart Griffin High School in Springfield, Illinois. I'm here with Raymond Oliver Erwin today, who was born on August 28th, 1947. In the interview with myself and Ray is Nathan Halledge, who will be doing the video shooting for us. So Ray, let's just start off with a few questions. You were in the Navy, is that correct?
Yes, I was.
What were you in a particular war, or?
I was in Vietnam in 1967 and 68.
Okay. Did you enlist? Were you drafted?
I enlisted.
You enlisted an officer? What was your highest rank established?
I was a seaman.
Okay. At the time that you enlisted, where were you living? In LaSalle?
I was living in Peru, Illinois.
Okay, Peru, Illinois. How did you pick the Navy over the other branches?
My dad had been in the Navy during World War II, and I thought, you know, that might be easier. I wouldn't be going to Vietnam. Unfortunately, I did, joining the Navy. It was going to be for 2 years.
Okay. And where did you do your training or boot camp at? Do you remember?
I was in Great Lakes Naval.
Okay. Sure. Up near the Chicago area. Do you remember who your instructors were, what you went through during that time?
No, that's been almost 40 years.
Okay. So where exactly in Vietnam did you serve?
Almost everywhere. We were in Da Nang. We were up almost every river. I was on an LST,
okay,
which is a landing ship tank. It only needs 8 feet of water. So basically you take troops, equipment, almost everything imaginable that they need, and would be sometimes 100, 200 miles upriver. You know, places probably we weren't supposed to be at, dropping off equipment and troops. So we'd drop them off usually in the middle of the night, and then we'd back up and leave. So we, basically a supply ship, did almost everything from hauling ammunition, equipment, napalm, just about everything you can think of, we've hauled.
Wow. So a lot of covert operations then, I would imagine?
Sometimes, yes.
Okay. So what exactly was your assignment?
Basically on deck, we also had 3 guns on our ship, 3-inch 50s, that I was a loader on one of the guns. And sometimes when we went upriver, we were given rifles in case we had to shoot, because basically our ship had a bow door in the front of it, so you could, if you had to, we also had booms. We could either boom the cargo over the sides or put the landing door down, land up to the beach, and let the people and equipment drive right off or walk off to the beach.
Okay.
So
I'm sure, did you see combat?
We were shot at many times, yes.
Okay.
Because when you're going up these rivers, you, even by our own troops, you look like a Russian trawler when your booms are up in the air and you're going to unload. So sometimes they would take us for not friendlies until we gave the code sign who we were. Sometimes we'd get shot over our bow, and as soon as we gave our code name, then they let us go. Sometimes we snuck by through in the fog, and they would miss us and wouldn't even know we were, you know, farther than where we were supposed to be. So.
Were there many casualties in your unit?
There was only 2 incidents when I was on board. One, we were hauling some trailers upriver with equipment, and one of the trailers fell. It killed one of the servicemen. The other one was severely injured, and then myself in the about 11 months I was there.
Okay. Do you want to tell us what happened, your experience?
Okay, we were about more than 100 and less than 200 miles up country. We were booming cargo with a winch. I was operating the winch. The cable is probably more than 6 inches in circumference. We were booming cargo to a landing craft in front of us. I could only see the gentleman in front. I was standing next to the winch making sure the cable was going out. He backed down where he wasn't supposed to. When he did, the cable snapped. When the cable snapped, It took my right leg completely off, shot me up in the air about 15 feet and 40 feet across the deck.
Wow.
So the only way they could basically save me was turn the ship around, head back about 100 miles in country, try to get a helicopter to come low treetop level, to come in. We had a landing where you could land helicopters, big enough, landed and take me to the USS Princeton, which was a medical ship, to try to save me. So.
Well, and obviously they were successful in that.
Yes.
Ray, were you during the time when your leg was snapped off? Tell us about that. Were you conscious?
No, I wasn't conscious at all. Yeah, I was completely knocked out because you lose so much blood so fast. They did get me to the USS Princeton. I remember that they tried to attach the leg. There was very little bit left attached, but it didn't work. So then basically they amputated what was left of the leg. They put me in a body cast from my neck all the way down. Everything from my waist all the way down was either shattered, broke, or torn due to the damage. I lost a good part of my hearing on the right side. I lost part of my memory due to the head injury. And it was, they finally, after they got me stabilized on the USS Princeton, after about a week, they shipped me into Da Nang. And they brought us in on a helicopter. There was 2 Marines and myself. They were in worse shape than I was. And we had to fly treetop level about 200 miles to get into Da Nang. And I remember telling the Marine, if we go down, don't leave us here, because all of us were in very bad shape. Said, if you have to go down, shoot us, don't just leave us here, because none of us could move. All of us were in extremely bad condition. Well, I was in Da Nang for about 2 weeks when they stabilized us. They had metal stitches in my stump, which were approximately about 2.5 to 3 inches, and huge staples. That at that time, that's what they did, and stapled your leg. And they flew us on the old Air Force C-130s into the United States over Alaska, and I was in the Philadelphia Marine and Naval Hospital there. And that's where I was for approximately like 10 months, 10 to 11 months. They didn't know if I'd be able to walk again because my legs were so damaged. And that's where I had like 8 doctors and 6 physical therapists working with me to try to teach me, like a stroke victim, to think a new thought to get the nerves to work again, to walk. And I didn't take my first step for 6 months. So.
You're still able to walk today? Are you able
Oh,
to
yes,
walk today?
yes.
Okay. So how long were you actually in Vietnam then? Between...
I was there approximately about 11 months.
Okay.
I was going to be stationed there for 2 years unless they moved me the last year. So.
Did you receive any medals, citations as a result of?
Basically, I got the Vietnam Medal from, of course, our country. There was another medal, I can't remember what it was. And then we get, anybody that served in Vietnam, we got the Vietnamese medal with 2 little bronze stars on the medal for serving in both Tet Offensive, which was the most severe fighting in Vietnam at that time. That's basically it.
Okay. So when you were over there before you were injured and shipped back, were you able to stay in touch with your family through letters, phone calls?
Through letters. We didn't have the phone systems or email or anything like that you have today. Just basically letters and sending us packages. You know, sometimes it would take 6 weeks for a package to get there, and they'd wrap up the cookies and brownies and aluminum foil and popcorn. They might be stale, but I always had enough friends to help me eat it. They were grateful to have anything because you didn't see a lot of the supplies. We were eating a lot of K rations, which were from World War II.
Wow.
So we were grateful for anything.
Yeah, 6-week stale cookies sound much better than 20-year-old K rations on any day. Obviously, those were very yummy. So since you were so far from north there, I'm assuming that supplies were stretched pretty thin throughout the whole conflict, or?
It depends what you mean, what supplies. I mean, we had enough armament and stuff that we were hauling up in troops. We would pull in and resupply because our ship was stationed out of Japan. So sometimes every couple of months we would go back, resupply. Sometimes we brought pontoons that would be loaded on the beach and stretched all the way out for a mile so an LST could put their bow door down and let the jeeps drive right to the beach. So if we could, we would, and there was enough room and there was enough water, we would go right up to the beach and drop our bow doors and let off the equipment. But that wasn't always possible, depending on the water and stuff like that, how deep it was. We needed that 8 feet.
Yeah.
So we drank and ate some strange things. We never had regular milk. We either had powdered milk or goat's milk. Sometimes we traded with people in country, goat's milk and things like that. Sometimes we ate things that I really didn't want to know what I was eating, whether it was water buffalo or whatever. But we usually carried enough supplies for like 6 weeks to 8 weeks at a time, since we were a supply ship. Our plans would change dramatically when the one ship, the Pueblo, was captured in Korea. We had to go all the way back to Japan. We were going to, since it was winter there, they issued winter gear and we were stockpiled and ready to go, and they changed us at the last minute. We had to unload the ship again and go back to Vietnam. Sometimes we would put it into the Philippines. We got into Hong Kong one time for one R&R for 5 days. And that's basically it. We would pull in wherever we needed to supply, sometimes Da Nang, where we picked up supplies and troops. It changed from moment to moment, day to day. So you never knew where you're going to be.
So is living, never knowing where you're going to be with the enemy constantly around you, is that extremely stressful on you, or did you learn to cope with the stress?
I think you coped with the stress. Our days were normally about 18 hours long. If we went into a major operation where we had to unload and helicopters didn't land, but we put it in cargo nets, it was not unusual for us to sleep on the deck and go for 3 or 4 days without hardly any sleep, loading equipment that had to be loaded. Sometimes we go in a convoy and they would bombard the beach before we would make a landing. So we'd be the last at the tail end with our little 3-inch 50s while the big destroyers and the big guns would be firing and would shake our whole ship. Even 3/4 of a mile away from them, the whole ship would shake when they fired their guns. And it would light up the whole sky. And it was like daylight, even at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the pitch dark. So
I can imagine that would be very rough. Do you have any good luck charm, anything you guys did for good luck?
not really.
Hope for the best, I guess. How about entertainment there?
No. Bob Hope was over there on some of the ships, and we saw the ship he was on, but that was the extent of it. We never, with an LST, you only landed to drop off stuff and come into Da Nang or Philippines or Japan. Sometimes you'd only be in Japan for a few days, enough to load equipment. In December of '67, when you guys had the worst snowstorm, Japan had the worst snowstorm. We had to actually buy shovels and shovel off the couple of feet of snow off the deck before we could leave, because there was so much snow. It was the worst snowstorm they had ever had in many years. So,
just day to day, how did you guys keep yourself entertained?
you were usually standing watch when you weren't working on the ship. When I first came on the ship, they make everybody kind of like part of a cook as well as cleanup crew. So when the Marines were aboard, you had to watch everything to make sure they didn't take everything, because they would take everything and unscrew it, lamps, beds, mattresses. They would take everything with them if they could. So you had to make sure, sometimes you'd have to check their equipment, if you could, to make sure that they weren't walking away with half the ship before they departed. Sometimes that wasn't always possible, and things would disappear afterwards, and the captain, of course, wasn't too happy about that because he was responsible for it. But we always landed at night. We never landed in the daytime. Usually it was 1 to 3, 4 o'clock in the morning when we'd take troops in the dark up the river. Probably one of the scariest times is we went up one night in the fog, and we got up probably, I don't know, 75 miles in country, had passed 2 checkpoints that they didn't see us. Nobody saw us. None of our troops saw us go up this river. And we got up and got a flash from shore when it was just breaking light. And the guy said, completely stop. The whole area is mined. The whole inlet is mined. And that kind of worried us because they come out in a little rowboat. And I thought, we're in trouble now. And we had to station everybody with guns on both sides of the ship if we were going to hit a mine to shoot it. And he brought out a big map for us to back up and turn around and go back, because we had missed our spot we were supposed to turn.
Wow.
So that was one of the scariest times. The VC sometimes would set up mortars on both sides of these small rivers because you didn't have a lot of room, and would sometimes mortar us. Sometimes when we got the bow door down, we landed on the beach, they would do the same things. One time we broke one of our bow door, and we had to limp back into the Philippines to have it re-welded. And we're taking on water the whole time to get back. Most of the time we were pretty safe. I know one of the LSTs, and I don't remember the name, probably about 2 months after I was back in the United States, they got caught on one of the little inlets, and the VC mortared both sides of the ship. And I think there was only 15 or 20 guys actually got off. They had a Marines and Navy, and they hit the conning deck, which means it knocked out all the steering. And basically they got most of the Navy and Marines. And even with the watertight hatches, that ship went down in about 20 minutes. So yeah, it was very dangerous.
On average, how many officers and enlisted men would serve on an LST, and then how many Marines could you guys carry on their ship?
Normally we only had a crew of about 80 to 90 of naval. Officers, I'm thinking around a dozen.
Okay.
There was about 5 or 6 chiefs, master sergeants like that, the Navy. Marines, we could haul up usually a couple hundred, depending on how much troops. One time when we were upriver, the VC had hit one of the tanks, our tanks, and it had knocked off the tread, so they pulled it in by a bulldozer, and we had to bring it back to be repaired. Normally you could haul up quite a few trailers, as well as jeeps and equipment. They had used the LSTs during World War II. Ours was made in 1952. Surprisingly, that LST is still working today in South America with one of the countries down there. They use it as like a cargo hauler. They've taken off the gun mounts and stuff. There's only 2 LSTs in the United States. One has been redone, and the other one is still waiting for money to try to restore it. The rest, there's only about a half a dozen LSTs from World War II and early 50s still in other countries that are left. That's about it.
Wow.
That I know of, anyways.
Okay. Obviously a very good ship, but there's still a couple of them still in action nearly.
Well, they've redone them and, of course,
Sure.
put bigger diesel engines in them than what we had and stuff like that. They only cruise at about 12 knots, and that was on a good day. Most of the time, you weren't there for speed. You were there to haul equipment.
Okay.
So,
During your service, do you remember any particularly humorous or unusual event? Or any pranks that people would pull?
well, there was always talk of ghosts on the ship. And strange things did happen. Sometimes equipment did move on the ship. No one could ever figure out if somebody was playing a joke or not. I was on a watch one night when we had a black naval personnel who was very deathly scared of ghosts, and they had talked about it. One of the guys had snuck up over the kind of counting tower and just reached his hand over and touched him, and the guy fainted. And we had to wake up a med tech in the middle of the night to come up, and that's so the captain would know to revive him, because everybody was scared that he got hurt, but he just had fainted. Basically that. I mean, playing tricks on each other once in a while, but most of the time we didn't really have a lot of time other than working on the ship. And when we weren't working on the ship or hauling stuff or moving equipment, we were on duty. We were stationed on deck to watch out for, other things in the water. One time we got caught in nets the fishermen had out in one of these lakes, little ponds, and our propellers got caught. We had to send somebody down in the water to cut their cables, and they weren't too happy with us with their fish nets. We had to cut them. That's kind of basically,
Okay.
yeah.
So after your service, you came back to the United States. You said you were in Philadelphia Hospital?
Philadelphia Naval Hospital.
For about
11 months, yeah.
And then after that, did you return to Peru, or?
I returned to Peru, and from there I took a civil service test to work for Department of Corrections. I was only out of the hospital about 3 or 4 days, saw it in the paper, took the civil service test on Saturday, and was working for Department of Corrections on Monday. Even though I still wasn't discharged from the Navy, they told me my papers would come eventually. I was working for Department of Corrections for about 4 or 5 months before my papers finally came through that I was discharged.
Okay.
So if they would have called me back, I would have had to have left my job and go back into the service if they wanted me.
So how long did you work with Department of Corrections?
I worked for 32 years and retired in '99.
That was in Peru? Or?
No, that was in the Joliet area.
Okay.
I started as a guard and worked my way up to a supply supervisor 2. I worked as a guard for 8 years. I worked as a supply supervisor 1 for the commissary, and then a supply supervisor 2. I ran part of the general store with 5 sets of books, and that was basically equal to a captain when I retired.
So while you were in the service, did you make any close friends that you still communicate with?
No, I basically, you were there for, we were always turning personnel over constantly. They had marked my records top secret, and when I was discharged, retired from the service, I only got $65 a month. I couldn't open up my records till about a little less than 8 years ago, something like that. And so, since my wife is very computer savvy teacher, she got on the internet and put the word out what ship I was on, and we got about 6 people that answered and a couple people that were there on the day of the injury, because that was the first question the VA wanted to know. Did I keep in contact with anybody, and did somebody actually see the paper? We did contact JAG. The accident report is very vague. It does not give in any detail how I was hurt, other than I was hurt, and kind of coordinates. That's about it. It's about 3 little lines. So we had to work from there, and I basically had to pay for all my specialists to prove my injuries. Both knees are shot, both hips are shot. Most of the nerves in both legs are shot, so I take seizure medication. I take about 8 medications now. So in that time that we filed, and I had the VFW represent me, because you have to have them or the DAV, Disabled Veterans, represent you for each case. And basically the Veterans Administration dragged this out for like 6.5 years. Then they put me on what's called, I had already retired from the state in '99. I had filed a couple of years before then because I knew my legs were really giving out. I couldn't hardly walk anymore without a cane. When they finally, they heard all the cases, they awarded me what is called 100%, and they said individual unemployability. Basically, they said I could never work another job again. I was too severely injured. But they also put the last little paragraph in their page and you can only go back and win 2 years back pay. You can't go back all the years you filed beforehand. They told me to apply for my Social Security benefits under disabled, that I couldn't work, which I did immediately. That went for about 10 months. They told me I was turned down twice. I had to hire an attorney, had to file for my disability Social Security. They told me they were going to find me a job, but after almost 3 inches of solid paperwork of specialists that I had paid for with my knees, and all the nerves and stuff were basically injured in hips. I was like a stroke victim learning how to walk again when I started to walk. They basically did put me on disability Social Security just a few years ago.
Okay.
So.
So are you a member of the Veterans Agency currently, DAV? Or
DAV.
Okay.
DAV, yes.
Okay. I knew you said they've represented you, but I wasn't sure.
Well, the VFW represented me, but I get magazines for both of them.
Okay. But you're not particularly active in
No, no.
Okay. Did your military experience influence your thinking about war or the military in general?
Yes and no. I believe in my country. I believe in fighting for my country, for our rights. As I'm older now, I look back and think there were times when I saw we lost a lot of young people that were 18, 19 years old. I was only 20 when I started over there. I was hurt 19 days before I was 21. By the time I got back to the statesides, I was 21. There were times I thought, when you take a hill 3 or 4 times, and then you lose so many people when we take troops in, and come back and drop off 120 people, and come back 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 6 weeks later, and there'd be 10 or 12 people, that was all that was left. They were either wounded or dead. I did think that at that time. We were losing a war that we couldn't win because their thinking was totally different than ours, where if you gave them a handful of rice and 3 bullets, they'd stay out there, they'd run out of rice, but they'd use all 3 bullets before they came back to get their next 3 bullets and a handful of rice. And at that thinking, I don't think we could win the war unless we decimated the whole country. As Americans, I think we're used to winning the war in 5 years or less. When that doesn't happen, we become very disoriented in the thinking with our politicians. Some decisions were made wrong, and like any war. I think we took a lot of the cream of our crop of our young men, and now with Afghanistan and Iraq and everything else, I'm very worried about our young men and women that are over there now. I don't know if the VA is going to be able to handle the more expensive prosthetics and whatnot. More than about 15 years ago, it seems like a lot of things have changed with the Veterans Administration. My last leg that I got 5 months ago, I went through my wife's insurance company. Basically, they've changed the rules that even though you're a disabled veteran, if you have insurance, they bill your insurance company. The last time I went to see about getting a new leg made since my other one was so bad, they said I could be on a waiting list 3 to 4 years. I said I couldn't wait that long. I'd be in a wheelchair. So we went through my wife's insurance company. They paid for it in Medicare, and that's how I got the new leg with titanium and carbon fiber and a sports foot, which would take more pressure off my knees and hips because I'm older and I don't move as fast as I used to. So I believe in our country, but I believe sometimes we need to take some better steps before we move in and don't realize that we're going to be there 10 to 20 years. We're not going to be there just 1 or 2 years. So,
is there anything else you'd like to add that we haven't already covered in the interview?
No, was surprised to get from Nate to be interviewed. I know a lot of the Vietnam veterans. We don't talk about the war too often. If we do, it might only be something funny, nothing serious, nothing terrible. I know for me, personally, I had malaria for 10 years after Vietnam. I couldn't watch any programs on Vietnam for more than 10 to 15 years. I'd have flashbacks. That was hard for my wife to deal with. You would be thinking you were in country, calling out fire calls and stuff like that and scaring people. It takes a long time. It takes a few years for you physically and mentally to recover. And I think they're noticing that more now than they did in Vietnam, to realize that the veterans saw an awful lot of death. And you never forget that.
Well, I thank you for your service to our country, Ray.
Thank you.